We have finally reached the end of the 19th century in this series, and it is time for us to take another tour through Latin America. We are going to check in on some countries that I have not mentioned in quite a while, and we are also going to take a look at some of the general patterns and trends that are emerging in the region as a whole. One important change that we see by the year 1900 is that traditional two-party systems are no longer nearly as common in the region as they were in the mid-19th century. By 1900, two-party systems continue to exist in only a handful of countries. Some countries' party systems have already transitioned into multi-party systems, and we saw an example of one of these transitions when we looked at Chile's coalition politics and the rise of the Radical Party. Other countries have moved in the opposite direction, and they have developed what are known as dominant party systems. These systems usually have multiple parties, but one of these parties is so much larger and more powerful than the others that it wins almost every election by huge margins. The party systems that we looked at in the last two videos in Argentina and Peru would both be considered dominant party systems by the year 1900. And in these cases, the dominant parties are the National Autonomous Party in Argentina and the Civil Party in Peru. Meanwhile, a large number of countries have developed an even less competitive type of party system known as a hegemonic party system, where there are no longer any viable opposition parties. This type of party system usually developed in countries like Mexico and Guatemala and Venezuela, where the Conservative Party was destroyed and the Liberal Party was the only party left standing. So in summary, by the year 1900, the region has moved beyond the realm of two-party politics, and we are starting to see much greater diversity in the size and balance of Latin American party systems. However, we see much less diversity when we turn our attention to the ideologies and policies of the governing parties at this time. Liberals are ascendant across most of Latin America at the start of the 20th century. The traditional liberal parties are still in power in countries like Guatemala, Ecuador, and Chile. Meanwhile, governing parties in countries like Costa Rica, Peru, Argentina, and Uruguay all adhere to a liberal ideology, even though they go by different names like Civil Party or National Autonomous Party. Colombia is the only country in Latin America where the traditional Conservative Party is still in power in 1900. But even the Colombian conservatives are starting to behave like small L liberals when it comes to economic policy, and they have fully embraced free trade and the agro-export model. By and large, Latin American conservatives have lost the political struggles of the late 19th century. The old order that the conservatives had sought to defend is already long gone by the year 1900, and Latin American liberals are busy building something new in its place. So far in this series, partisan revolutions have been the main tool that opposition parties used to gain executive power. But we are now finally reaching the end of that era. In 1900, we are in the middle of the last big wave of partisan revolutions in Latin America for quite some time. While partisan conflict will continue in a few countries like Honduras and Nicaragua, partisan revolutions become much less common in Latin America as a whole after the year 1905. Opposition parties throughout much of the region are starting to renounce their revolutionary postures and focus their attention on electoral organizing. Elections have already become quite competitive in a couple countries like Chile, Costa Rica, and Honduras by 1900, and we are about to see some major democratic openings in countries like Argentina and Uruguay as well. In many of these countries, opposition elites have concluded that elections now represent the safest and most viable path to political power in Latin America. Even though elections are becoming more competitive, the traditional landed elite continues to dominate the political system of nearly every Latin American country in the year 1900. But this elite is beginning to face challenges from other groups in society. Middle-class professionals, employees, and bureaucrats are tired of being confined to subordinate roles in these political systems. In some countries, members of the middle class are beginning to rise to more prominent positions in the traditional elite parties, while in other countries, the middle class is leading the push to organize new political parties that are no longer beholden to the traditional landed elite. Moreover, Latin American governments now have to contend with working class militancy. Although relatively few countries have large factories by the year 1900, the workers in medium-scale workshops, bakeries, mines, and meat-packing plants are becoming much more class-conscious by the end of the 19th century. Workers are starting to organize themselves into labor unions in order to push for higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. And they are also starting to embrace political ideologies such as anarchism and Marxism. During the first decade of the 20th century, strikes are a common occurrence in the large cities, mines, and early industrial areas throughout Latin America. And this sort of labor action is beginning to cause some serious economic disruption in the countries where the labor movement is the most developed. For now, Latin American governments' main strategy for dealing with these strikes is repression. But political leaders are beginning to realize that this repression is not sustainable over the long run. Something will have to be done to address the basic demands of the organized working class. Whether elites like it or not, the working class is about to force its way into the political system, and the only real questions are how this process will occur and who will benefit from it politically. Will the Latin American working class found its own socialist parties like the European working class did in the late 19th century? Or will Latin American elite parties find some way to address the workers' demands and incorporate the working class voters and labor activists into their own party's ranks? Will the traditional elite parties be forced out by new socialist organizations, or will these elite parties be able to harness this working class energy for their own electoral benefit? These are some of the major questions that lie on the horizon as Latin America's 20th century dawns. For the remainder of this video, I am now going to go country by country once again in order to check in on what is going on in each part of the region at the start of the 20th century. For most of the last 24 years, Mexico has been governed by the liberal general turned dictator Porfirio Diaz. President Diaz has sidelined the traditional civilian wing of the Liberal Party, and he has undercut every effort by political activists to establish Liberal Party organization. Next year, in 1901, there will be one final push to build a well-organized Liberal Party, though the organization that results will soon fall into the hands of anarchists. In the meantime, President Diaz wins every election by huge margins, and it seems unlikely that he will retire from power anytime soon. Guatemala's political system is only slightly more competitive. For a while, most presidential elections had featured multiple liberal candidates who were supported by different factions and liberal political clubs. However, even this limited internal competition within the Guatemalan Liberal Party is now at an end. The winner of the last election in 1896 is going to be sticking around for a while through a combination of fraud and repression against rival candidates. He will remain in power all the way until 1920, when he is finally overthrown through a short-lived revolution. El Salvador's Liberal Party has been facing some serious infighting, and rival liberal military leaders keep overthrowing each other in coups. The liberal leader who is currently in power in the year 1900 is a young general named Tomás Regalado, who seized power from the last guy just over a year ago. However, El Salvador's political system is about to stabilize. Regalado will step down from power at the end of his term in 1903, and most of El Salvador's subsequent leaders for the next 3 decades will come to power through regular, though highly uncompetitive, elections. Honduras is also in a state of transition. Its conservative party is long gone, but the ruling Liberal Party has fractured into several competing personalistic factions. In the early 20th century, these factions are finally starting to coalesce into 2 large, stable political blocs, and they are even doing some serious electoral organizing. They still have a long way to go, but these factions are eventually going to become the 2 elite parties that end up dominating Honduran politics throughout the 20th century, and Honduras will revert to having a 2-party system. In Nicaragua, the liberals took power through a revolution a couple of years ago, but they have neglected to enact the same social and economic reforms that their counterparts in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala implemented back in the 1870s. As a result, the Conservative Party in Nicaragua is going to survive for now. The current Liberal president, Jose Santos Zelaya, is hoping to persuade the United States to build its transoceanic canal through Nicaragua. But this effort is going to fail for a couple of reasons, and the canal will be built through Panama instead. However, the United States military is going to invade Nicaragua anyway, mostly in order to prevent any other great power from building the canal through Nicaragua. While they are there, the Americans are going to overthrow the Liberal Party and restore the Conservative Party to power. The U.S. Marines are going to stick around in Nicaragua for quite some time in order to prop up the conservative government and put down liberal uprisings. Moving south to Costa Rica, we encounter one of Latin America's most competitive political systems, but also one of the most unstable party systems in the region. There are a ton of parties in Costa Rica now, but none of them stick around for very long, and most of them are really just personalistic vehicles that are formed to support a single candidate, and they disappear as soon as the election is over. However, elections in Costa Rica are starting to become pretty competitive, and Costa Rica is one of the first countries in the region where opposition elites have a decent chance of winning the presidency through elections. Crossing the Caribbean, we arrive now at the newly independent country of Cuba. For the last 30 years, Cuban patriots have been waging an independence struggle against the Spanish authorities who still govern the island. This independence struggle eventually intersected with the Spanish-American War, and in 1900, Cuba is under U.S. military occupation. The United States is in the process of withdrawing from the island, though it has reserved the right to reoccupy Cuba whenever it chooses to do so. Next year, Cuba is going to elect its first president, the Cuban revolutionary Tomás Estrada Palma. The United States will end up invading the island once again after Estrada is overthrown in 1906. But Cuba's party system will eventually stabilize into a pretty competitive multi-party system in which the 2 leading parties are the right-wing Liberal Party and the left-wing nationalist Authentic Party. Haiti has developed an unusually racialized party system by Latin American standards. Its Liberal Party is associated with Haiti's mixed race or colored elite, while the National Party is more strongly associated with Haiti's black population. These parties offer slightly different economic visions for the country, but they are largely non-ideological personalistic groupings by this point. The Dominican Republic has also developed a two-party system. These parties have gone by a ton of different names over the final decades of the 19th century, but around the year 1900, they are starting to become known as simply the Blues and the Reds, Azules y Rojos. These parties are not very ideological, though the Reds tend to be a bit more conservative than the Blues. Turning south now to Venezuela, we hear the dying gasps of the traditional party system. The Liberals have been in power for most of the last 40 years, but the party is now deeply fractured by 1900. Just last year, a group of liberal military officers seized power from another liberal faction through a military coup that they called the Liberal Restorative Revolution. The two principal organizers of this coup, Cipriano Castro and Juan Vicente Gomez, are going to rule Venezuela into the mid-1930s. Under their rule, Venezuela will transform from a partisan dictatorship into an outright military dictatorship. What remains of Venezuela's Liberal Party is going to disintegrate, and party activity of any sort will be severely repressed until the 1940s. Colombia in 1900 is in the middle of its Thousand Days War. As we saw in a previous video, this war will be won by the conservative government, and the Liberal Party will be sidelined from power until the 1930s. This war will indirectly lead to Panama's independence from Colombia when the United States military intervenes on the side of the liberal rebels there. The main reason why the US gets involved in this conflict is because the Americans want to build the transoceanic canal through Panama, and they hope to turn the newly independent country of Panama into a US client state as a way to safeguard the United States' control over the canal zone. Construction of the canal is already underway in the year 1900, though the canal will not open for another 14 years. In Ecuador, the Liberals have just seized power in a partisan revolution. The Conservative Party will eventually be refounded in the 1920s, but for the time being, the Liberal Party is the only game in town. The situation in Peru should hopefully be familiar to us since we just had a video on Peru's civil party. The military government has just been overthrown through a guerrilla war supported by a multi-party alliance that included the civil party and the more populist Democratic Party. And apart from one brief interruption, civilians are going to remain in control of the state institutions for the next 3 decades. The civil party is re-emerging as the dominant party in Peruvian politics, and it is going to win almost all of the elections held over the next 20 years by huge margins. Bolivia is in a similar situation as Ecuador. The Bolivian Liberal Party has just seized power in a partisan revolution, and although the Liberals had relied on the support of indigenous leaders, the indigenous revolutionaries are now being sidelined from politics once again. Bolivia is going to continue to be governed by the traditional white economic elite for the foreseeable future, though the Liberals will be slightly more successful than their conservative predecessors at incorporating middle-class actors into their party. Next up, we have Paraguay, which is a country that I have said almost nothing about so far in this series, mostly because Paraguay was one of the very last countries in the region to develop political parties. Paraguay has been governed by a succession of personal dictators, but the last of these dictators, Francisco Solano Lopez, was killed during the War of the Triple Alliance, or the Paraguayan War, which pitted Paraguay against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. This war has been absolutely devastating for Paraguay, and it has resulted in the death of most of the country's male population. By some estimates, between 60 and 70% of Paraguay's pre-war population has died during this war. Two new elite parties have emerged in the aftermath of this conflict. Most of the early leaders of the Colorado Party had fought on the side of Francisco Solano Lopez, while many of the leaders of the rival Azul Party or Liberal Party were former exiles who had fought on the side of the Allied forces in a unit attached to the Argentine army. Though these distinctions have largely ceased to matter by the year 1900. The Colorados had been in power ever since the party system formed in the 1880s, though they are about to get overthrown in a liberal coup in 1904. In Brazil, the monarchy is now gone and the republic is finally beginning to consolidate. Under Brazil's first republic, political power now rests mostly in the hands of state-level political machines that have monopolized elections within their respective states. There is a national president and a Congress as well, but real political authority currently rests in the hands of state governors. We move south now to Uruguay, which is coming out of a major political crisis. That power-sharing arrangement that had given some of the local governments to the Blanco Party had collapsed a few years ago, and this led the Blancos to launch a new revolutionary uprising. While this civil war was going on, somebody assassinated the Colorado president Juan Iriarte Borda on his way out of church. The suspected assassin was a supporter of a rival Colorado leader named Jose Baije y Ordóñez. Rumors are swirling that Baije may have orchestrated the assassination, and Baije is frankly doing very little to dispel these rumors. He is even openly visiting the assassin in prison. Last year, Baije helped the president of the Senate, Juan Cuestas, seize power in a coup. Cuestas then negotiated a peace agreement with the Blanco rebel leader Aparicio Sarabia that restores the power-sharing arrangement and gives the Blancos a greater role in the national government. The political situation in Uruguay appears to be stabilizing for now, but everything is going to fall apart again in 1903 when Cuestas' term as president ends and Baije becomes the next president. Baije is going to renege on the deal with Sarabia, and this will lead Sarabia to launch a new revolutionary uprising in 1904. This time, the Blanco rebels will be decisively defeated by the Colorado government, and the 1904 Civil War will be the last major partisan revolution in Uruguay. Next up is Argentina, which is another country whose situation in the year 1900 should be familiar to us. The National Autonomous Party is still firmly entrenched in power, and the opposition party, the UCR, has just been dissolved during a power struggle between two of its rival leaders. However, the UCR will be refounded in a couple years from now, and it will re-emerge as a much stronger political party that has a broad multi-class base of support that it will use to win power in the 1916 presidential election. Meanwhile, Argentina's first labor confederation, the Fora, is about to be founded in 1901. The Fora is launched as a joint effort of syndicalist, anarchist, and socialist labor activists, but the anarchists will soon come to dominate the organization and the broader Argentine labor movement. The Fora is going to become one of the most formidable anarchist-led organizations in Latin American history. Finally, we arrive at Chile. Chile still has that strange quasi-parliamentary system that we talked about in an earlier video, where the cabinet is accountable to the Congress. All five of the major parties are rotating in and out of the cabinet every couple of months, and elections are highly competitive in Chile by the early 20th century. Partly as a result, Chilean parties are getting much better organized, and this process is being led by Chile's Radical Party, which has now established local assemblies throughout most of the country. Like Argentina, Chile is about to experience a major wave of labor unrest that is going to be violently repressed by the government. These last three countries, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, constitute the southern cone of South America, and these countries are going to demand a disproportionate amount of our attention in the next dozen videos in this series. It is in these three countries that Latin America's first stable democracies will emerge during the opening decades of the 20th century. It is also in these three countries that Latin America's first socialist parties will develop. Even many of the elite parties in the Southern Cone are about to become much better organized, and some of them are going to launch a major push to build an enduring multi-class base of support.